In the heart of 16th century West Africa, a woman rode at the head of an army of 20,000 warriors. Her sword gleamed in the Sahel's sun as she commanded men who would die for her without question. She conquered territories larger than modern-day nations, built walls that still stand 5 centuries later, and struck fear into the hearts of kings across the Sahara. Yet her name has been nearly erased from history. This is the story of Queen Amina of Zaria, the warrior princess who should have been as famous as Alexander the Great. What you're about to discover will change everything you thought you knew about African history, medieval warfare, and the power of women in the ancient world. To understand the legend of Amina, we must first journey back to a time when Europe was still emerging from its medieval darkness, when the Ottoman Empire was at its zenith, and when West Africa was home to some of the wealthiest and most sophisticated kingdoms on earth. The year is 1533. While Henry VIII rules England and the Inca Empire faces Spanish conquistadors, in the heart of what is now northern Nigeria, the Hausa city-states are thriving. These aren't primitive villages. These are bustling metropolitan centers of trade, learning, and military might. 7 major city-states dominate the region: Kano, Katsina, Zazzau, Gobir, Rano, Dora, and Biram. Together, they control the southern terminus of the trans-Saharan trade routes that have enriched North Africa and the Middle East for centuries. Zazzau, later known as Zaria, sits at a critical crossroads. To the north lie the salt mines of the Sahara. To the south, the forests rich with cola nuts, ivory, and enslaved peoples. Gold flows from the west, and from the east come horses from the Lake Chad region. Whoever controls Zazzau controls immeasurable wealth. The city itself is a marvel of medieval African engineering. Massive walls of red earth stretch for miles, punctuated by watchtowers where sentries scan the horizon for threats. Within these walls, mud brick buildings rise 2 and 3 stories high. Markets overflow with goods from as far away as Venice and Cairo. Scholars study mathematics, astronomy, and Islamic jurisprudence in centers of learning that rival those of Timbuktu. Blacksmiths forge weapons that can cut through imported European steel. This is no backwater. This is a civilization at its peak. Into this world of power, intrigue, and endless possibility, a child is born to the royal family. Her name is Amina, daughter of King Nikatau, the 22nd ruler of Zazzau, and Queen Bakwa Turunku. The year is approximately 1533, though some scholars place it as early as 1530 or as late as 1536. Historical records from this period are fragmentary, pieced together from oral traditions, Arabic chronicles, and the Kano Chronicle, the most comprehensive historical document of the Hausa states. From the moment of her birth, Amina is different. She is born into privilege, yes, but also into expectation. As a princess of Zazzau, she is raised not in seclusion, but in preparation. The Hausa kingdoms, unlike many societies of their era, recognize that women can hold power, can own property, can even rule. It is rare, but not impossible. Amina's father, King Nikatau, is a warrior king who has expanded Zazzau's borders through strategic marriages and calculated military campaigns. He understands that power in the Sahel doesn't come from divine right alone. It comes from the strength of your army, the shrewdness of your alliances, and your control of trade routes. These lessons will shape Amina's entire worldview. But Amina has a brother, Karama. In a patriarchal society, even one as relatively progressive as Zazzau, the throne typically passes to the male heir. Amina would have understood from an early age that her path to power would be anything but straightforward. Yet something extraordinary happens during Amina's childhood. Her mother, Bakwa Turunku, proves to be more than just a king's consort. She is a political force in her own right. When King Nikatau dies in 1549, the throne doesn't immediately pass to the young Karama. Instead, through political maneuvering that speaks to her formidable intelligence, Bakwa Turunku emerges as a power behind the throne, and some sources suggest she may have ruled as regent. This is where Amina receives her true education. While other noble girls might learn domestic arts, Amina learns the art of war. But what happens next would set the stage for one of history's most remarkable transformations. Imagine being a teenage girl in a world where your future is supposed to be defined by marriage alliances and childbearing. Now imagine making a choice that defies every expectation, a choice that would seem impossible, even insane, to those around you. Amina makes that choice. At an age when most princesses are learning courtly etiquette and preparing for strategic marriages to neighboring rulers, Amina demands military training, and remarkably, astonishingly, she gets it. The Hausa military tradition is sophisticated and brutal. Warriors train from childhood in horseback riding, sword fighting, spear throwing, and archery. They learn tactics passed down through generations, how to read terrain, how to coordinate cavalry charges, how to lay siege to walled cities. The military culture of the Sahel combines indigenous African martial traditions with influences from the Islamic world to the north and the cavalry tactics of the great empires of the Sudan. Amina throws herself into this world with a ferocity that stuns her instructors. She learns to ride before she can fully control a war horse. She trains with weapons until her hands bleed. She studies the campaigns of great generals, not just African leaders, but the tactics of the Byzantine Empire, the Mamluks of Egypt, and the Ottoman Turks whose influence is spreading across North Africa. But here's what makes Amina truly exceptional. She doesn't just learn to fight, she learns to lead. Leadership in a warrior culture isn't about being the strongest or the fastest. It's about commanding respect from men who have been raised to believe that women are their inferiors. It's about tactical brilliance that saves lives and wins victories. It's about a presence, an aura, that makes hardened warriors willing to follow you into certain death. Amina develops all of this. By her late teens, she is regularly accompanying Zazao's military expeditions, not as a symbolic figurehead or a political token, but as an active participant. She rides with the cavalry. She fights in skirmishes. She observes how battles are won and lost. She learns that war isn't glorious. It's calculated, methodical, and unforgiving. During this period, Zazao's military is engaged in almost constant low-level conflict. The Hausa city-states are rivals as much as allies. They compete for control of trade routes, for tributary states, for prestige. Small kingdoms to the south and west are constantly probing for weakness. Nomadic groups from the north raid for slaves and livestock. It's a world where military readiness isn't optional, it's survival. Amina distinguishes herself in several minor campaigns during the 1550s and early 1560s. The historical record is frustratingly sparse on specifics, but oral traditions preserved in Zaria speak of a princess who fought alongside men, who commanded a personal guard of elite warriors, and whose strategic insights impressed even the most experienced generals. But there's a complication, one that would test everything Amina had worked for. Her brother Karama ascends to the throne around 1549. As the new Sarki, the title for the king of Zazao, Karama is now the supreme military commander. Amina, despite her skills, is subordinate to him. In most societies, this would be the end of her martial career. She would be married off to cement an alliance, relegated to the women's quarters, her warrior days nothing more than an eccentric footnote in the kingdom's history. But Karama makes a decision that will change the course of West African history. He recognizes his sister's genius. Instead of sidelining Amina, Karama elevates her. He gives her command of cavalry units. He consults her on military strategy. He sends her as his representative on campaigns. It's unprecedented, a woman holding military rank in a patriarchal society. Some traditionalists in the court are scandalized, but Karama understands something crucial. Amina is the best military mind in Zazzau, perhaps in all the Hausa states. To ignore her talents because of her gender would be strategically suicidal. For the next 16 years, from approximately 1549 to 1565, Amina serves as one of Zazao's leading military commanders under her brother's reign. She leads expeditions to subdue rebellious tributary states. She defends against incursions from rival kingdoms. She oversees the fortification of Zazao's defenses. All the while, she's building something even more valuable than military victories. She's building loyalty. The warriors who serve under Amina develop a fanatical devotion to her. She shares their hardships on campaign. She ensures they're fed and paid. She mourns their dead and celebrates their victories. She proves herself in combat again and again. Slowly, the idea of a woman warrior becomes not just acceptable, but admired. But even as Amina's reputation grows, she faces a choice that every woman in her position has faced throughout history: marriage. Pressure mounts for Amina to marry. Alliance marriages are the currency of medieval politics. A union with a neighboring royal house could bring peace, trade agreements, military pacts. Amina's marriage could secure Zazao's borders for a generation. Amina refuses. According to tradition, she takes a revolutionary stance. She will never marry permanently. Some sources suggest she takes lovers, captured princes or warriors who catch her eye, but sends them away after a single night. Other accounts claim she remains celibate, married only to warfare and statecraft. Whatever the truth, the message is clear. Amina will not be controlled through marriage. She will not be used as a pawn in someone else's political game. This decision is radical beyond modern comprehension. In 16th century West Africa, as in most of the world, a woman's value is largely determined by her role as wife and mother. By rejecting marriage, Amina is rejecting the fundamental social contract of her era. She's declaring that she exists for herself, that her destiny is her own to command. It's a declaration that will be tested in ways she cannot yet imagine. Because in 1565, after ruling for 16 years, King Karama dies, and everything changes. The death of a king in medieval Africa is never simple. It's a moment of maximum danger, a window when rivals strike, when ambitious nobles plot, when neighboring kingdoms probe for weakness. In the power vacuum that follows Karama's death, Zazo stands at a precipice. The court must choose a new Sarki, and the choice they face is unprecedented. There are male relatives who could claim the throne, cousins, nephews, distant branches of the royal family. Any of them would be a traditional choice, safe, expected, unremarkable. But there is also Amina. By 1565, Amina is in her early 30s. In the prime of her life by medieval standards, she has commanded troops for 16 years. She has proven her strategic brilliance in countless campaigns. She has the loyalty of the military. She has the respect of the people. And perhaps most importantly, she has cultivated relationships with the power brokers at court, the merchants whose trade she protects, the Islamic scholars whose authority legitimizes rule, the noble families whose sons serve under her command. The deliberations are intense. Some court officials argue for tradition. A male ruler has always led Zazo. Others point out that tradition also demands competence, and no male candidate can match Amina's qualifications. The military, predictably, strongly supports Amina. They've seen her genius firsthand. They know that under her leadership, Zazo will be secure. But there's another factor, one whispered in corners and debated in hushed councils. What will the other house estates think? What will rival kingdoms do if they see Zazo led by a woman? Will it be seen as weakness? Will it invite attack? Amina's supporters make a compelling argument. Let them come. Let them test Zazo's defenses and see how quickly they regret it. In the end, Amina ascends to the throne. The exact mechanism isn't clear from historical sources, whether it was unanimous, contested, or achieved through political maneuvering. But by 1565, Amina is Sarki of Zazo, Queen Amina. The warrior princess has become the warrior queen. The coronation ceremonies blend Islamic and traditional Hausa elements. Islamic scholars recite prayers recognizing her sovereignty. Traditional priests perform rituals connecting her to the earth and ancestors of Zazo. Warriors pledge their swords to her service. Merchants present tribute, acknowledging her protection of trade routes. The people of Zaria fill the streets, cheering for their new queen. But Amina knows that ceremony means nothing without power, and power in the world of the Hausa city-states comes through military might. She doesn't waste time. Within months of her coronation, some sources say within weeks, Amina launches her first campaign as queen. Her target is strategic, a southern territory that has been resisting Zazo's authority and threatening trade caravans heading to the forest regions. It's both a test of her rule and a message to anyone who might see a woman on the throne as an opportunity for rebellion. Amina personally leads an army estimated at 20,000 warriors. This is an enormous force for the period, requiring sophisticated logistics, supply lines, and command structure. The army includes cavalry mounted on horses from the Lake Chad region, infantry armed with spears and swords, archers with powerful composite bows, and siege engineers capable of breaching fortified settlements. The campaign is swift and decisive. Amina employs tactics that will become her signature: rapid cavalry movements, psychological warfare, strategic encirclement, and an almost preternatural ability to read terrain and enemy movements. Within weeks, the rebellious territory submits. Its ruler swears allegiance to Zazao. Trade routes are secured. But here's where Amina reveals her true innovation. After conquering the territory, she does something no previous Hausa ruler has done systematically. She orders the construction of walls around the newly conquered settlement. Not just simple stockades, but massive earthwork fortifications. Thick walls of compressed earth designed to withstand siege weapons and cavalry charges. These walls serve a dual purpose. They protect the settlement from external attack, and they ensure that rebellion from within is virtually impossible. This is the birth of Amina's most enduring legacy, the Amina Walls. Over the next few years, as her conquests expand, Amina will fortify every major settlement under her control. These walls, many of which still stand in modern Nigeria 5 centuries later, become synonymous with her rule. They're defensive structures, yes, but they're also symbols of permanence, of Amina's intention to hold what she conquers, of Zazao's transformation from one city-state among many to the dominant power in the region. But fortifications alone don't build an empire. Amina understands that lasting power requires more than military might. It requires economic dominance. She turns her attention to the trade routes. The trans-Saharan trade is the lifeblood of West African kingdoms. Gold, ivory, cola nuts, enslaved people, and other goods flow north across the Sahara to North Africa and the Mediterranean world. Salt, horses, textiles, weapons, and luxury goods flow south. The kingdoms that control the routes grow wealthy beyond measure. The kingdoms that don't stagnate and die. Amina begins a systematic campaign to extend Zazao's control over these routes. She conquers key trading towns. She establishes military garrisons at critical junctions. She negotiates or coerces agreements with merchant clans and caravans, ensuring that they pay tribute to Zazu in exchange for protection from bandits and rival kingdoms. By the late 1560s, Zazao, under Amina's rule, controls trade routes stretching from the forest regions of the south to the Sahara in the north, and from the territory of the Nupe kingdom in the west toward Lake Chad in the east. The wealth flowing into Zaria is unprecedented. The city grows. New markets open. Artisans and merchants from across West Africa flock to the capital, drawn by security and opportunity. But with prosperity comes danger. Success breeds envy, and envy breeds enemies. The other Hausa city-states, Kano, Katsina, Gobir, watch Zasu's rise with growing alarm. They see their own trade revenues declining as merchants choose Amina's protected routes. They see tributary states they once dominated now paying allegiance to Zaria. They see a shift in the regional balance of power that threatens their own positions, and they begin to plot. Diplomatic pressure comes first. Emissaries arrive in Zaria with gifts and honeyed words, suggesting that perhaps Zazo is expanding too quickly, that perhaps Queen Amina should focus on internal development rather than external conquest, that perhaps it would be better for regional stability if the trade routes were shared more equitably. Amina's response is cordial but firm. Zazzau will continue to expand as long as there are territories to conquer and trade routes to secure. Any kingdom that wishes to challenge this policy is welcome to try. It's a challenge that several kingdoms will soon accept. But before that confrontation comes, Amina makes a decision that will reshape the geopolitical landscape of West Africa for generations. A decision so bold, so audacious, that when word spreads, rulers from Cairo to the Atlantic coast take notice. What happens next will prove whether Amina is merely a capable military leader or something far more extraordinary. It's approximately 1568, 3 years into Amina's reign. Zazzau is prosperous, well-defended, and militarily dominant in its immediate region. Most rulers would consolidate at this point. enjoy the fruits of success, strengthen internal governance, rest on their laurels. Amina is not most rulers. She stands in her war council chamber, surrounded by her most trusted generals. Maps made of leather and fabric spread across wooden tables, marked with stones and shells indicating settlements, trade routes, and military forces. Her commanders, hardened veterans who have fought beside her for years, wait for her to speak. Amina's finger traces a route on the map, moving south and west, far beyond Zazao's current borders. She's proposing something that seems impossible, a campaign to conquer territories all the way to the Quararafa kingdom in the south and toward Nupe in the southwest. These aren't minor border skirmishes. This is empire building on a scale not seen in Hausa land for generations. Her generals are skeptical. The logistics alone are staggering. They're talking about multiple campaigns, thousands of miles of territory, battles against kingdoms with their own powerful armies. The resources required, food, weapons, horses, manpower, would strain even Zazao's considerable wealth. But Amina has thought this through. She doesn't propose conquest for glory or personal ambition. She sees a strategic imperative. The kingdoms to the south and west control resources that Zazo needs: forest products, agricultural lands, and crucially, access to different trade networks that connect to the Atlantic coast, where European traders are beginning to appear in significant numbers. Moreover, if Zazo doesn't expand, its rivals will. The balance of power in West Africa is constantly shifting. Stagnation is the same as decline. To secure Zazo's future, Amina must strike now, while she has momentum, resources, and a battle-hardened army. Her generals recognize the logic. They also recognize something else. Amina's strategic vision is generations ahead of its time. She's not thinking about next year or even the next decade. She's thinking about Zazo's position in a changing world where transatlantic trade might soon rival trans-Saharan routes, where European technology and weapons are entering Africa, where the old certainties are crumbling. The campaign begins in 1569. Amina assembles the largest army Zazo has ever fielded. Estimates from various sources suggest somewhere between 20 and 25,000 warriors, an enormous force for pre-industrial Africa. This army includes cavalry units that are among the best in West Africa, infantry armed with iron-tipped spears and swords, archers, and specialized units for siege warfare. The first targets are smaller kingdoms and settlements on Zazo's southern border. These campaigns serve as both military objectives and training exercises, allowing Amina to test her logistics, identify capable junior officers, and refine tactics for the larger conflicts to come. The pattern of conquest becomes predictable. Rapid cavalry approach, psychological intimidation through displays of force, offers of peaceful submission with reasonable terms, and if refused, overwhelming military assault. Amina fights not to annihilate, but to conquer. She wants tributary states that will trade, pay taxes, and provide military support, not depopulated wastelands. Settlement after settlement falls. Some resist and are crushed. Others submit without a fight, calculating that Amina's terms are better than destruction. After each conquest, Amina's engineers, skilled builders who have perfected earthwork construction, begin building walls. The Amina walls start to spread across the landscape like a connected network of fortified points, each one a statement of Zazo's permanence. But as Amina pushes deeper into southern territories, she encounters more organized resistance. The Quararafa, a powerful confederation of peoples to the southeast, have been watching Amina's expansion with growing alarm. They're not some minor kingdom to be easily conquered. They have their own sophisticated military traditions, their own network of alliances, and a fierce determination not to become Zazo's subjects. The first major battle between Amina's forces and the Quararafa occurs near a river crossing that both sides recognize as strategically crucial. Control of this crossing means control of trade routes connecting the forest regions to the Sahel. Amina arrives with her main army to find Quararafa forces already entrenched on the far bank. It's a strong defensive position. Trying to cross the river under fire would result in catastrophic casualties. A conventional commander might lay siege, waiting for the enemy to run out of supplies, or might seek an alternative crossing, potentially adding weeks to the campaign. Amina does neither. Under cover of darkness, she sends cavalry units upstream and downstream, searching for alternative crossings. But this is a feint. Her real plan is far more audacious. She orders her engineers to construct rafts and floating platforms, not enough to transport her entire army, but enough for a shock force of elite warriors. As dawn breaks, Amina launches a coordinated assault. While her main army makes noise at the primary crossing point, drawing Quararafa attention and forces, her elite units cross at two different points simultaneously using the rafts. The Quararafa find themselves attacked from three directions at once. Their defensive position collapses. Within hours, the battle is over, with Quararafa forces in full retreat. It's a masterpiece of tactical innovation. Amina has demonstrated that she can outthink as well as outfight her enemies. Word of the battle spreads rapidly. Other kingdoms in the region face a choice: submit to Zhao or risk facing Amina's army in battle. Most choose submission. Over the next several years, from approximately 1569 to 1573, Amina conducts campaign after campaign, each one extending Zhao's reach further from the capital. Her army becomes a well-oiled military machine. Supply lines stretch for hundreds of miles, maintained by a complex system of garrison towns and tributary states obligated to provide resources. Her cavalry becomes legendary, fast, disciplined, capable of covering enormous distances and striking with devastating effect. But Amina's genius isn't just military. She understands that conquest means nothing without administration. As territories fall under her control, she implements a governance system that is remarkably sophisticated for its time. Local rulers who submit peacefully are generally allowed to continue governing their own people, provided they pay tribute to Zhao, contribute warriors to Amina's army when required, and protect trade routes through their territories. This system of indirect rule allows Amina to control vast territories without maintaining large occupation forces everywhere. For territories that resist and are conquered by force, Amina installs governors from Zaria, usually successful military commanders or trusted administrators. These governors are given significant autonomy but are ultimately accountable to the queen. They're expected to maintain order, collect taxes, and ensure that Zhao's interests are protected. The revenue flowing into Zaria becomes enormous. Gold, ivory, kola nuts, textiles, livestock, and enslaved people captured in wars all contribute to the royal treasury. Amina uses this wealth not just for personal luxury, although she certainly enjoys the trappings of power, but to fund further military campaigns, to improve Zaria's infrastructure, and to support the Islamic scholars and traditional priests whose blessing legitimizes her rule. By 1574, Zhao, under Amina's rule, has become the dominant power in Hausa land. Her territory extends from the fringes of the Sahara to the forest regions of the south, and from Nupe lands in the west to territories approaching Lake Chad in the east. She's not quite created an empire on the scale of Mali or Songhai, but she's built something unprecedented for a Hausa ruler, a unified, militarily powerful state that can project force across hundreds of miles. But success, as Amina is about to discover, creates its own problems. The other Hausa city-states can no longer ignore Zhao's dominance. Kano and Katsina, the two most powerful traditional rivals to Zhao, begin coordinating their policies. They reach out to kingdoms that Amina hasn't yet conquered, offering alliances and military support. They spread propaganda suggesting that Amina's rule is illegitimate, that a woman leading warriors is contrary to Islamic law, that Zhao has grown arrogant and must be brought low. Trade wars erupt. Merchants from Kano and Katsina refuse to use Amina's routes. They establish alternative paths, even though these are longer and more dangerous. They spread rumors of Amina's cruelty, her ambition, her dangerous innovations. Diplomatic isolation follows. When Amina sends emissaries to other courts, they're received coldly or not at all. Marriage alliances that might have secured peace are refused. Religious leaders in rival kingdoms issue fatwas questioning Amina's legitimacy. And then in late 1574 or early 1575, Amina receives intelligence that confirms her worst fears. Kano, Katsina, and several smaller Hausa states are forming a military coalition. Their explicit goal, to invade Zhao, depose Amina, and divide her territories among themselves. It's the crisis Amina has been preparing for since taking the throne. Everything she's built, the walls, the tributary states, the army, the trade network, is about to be tested in the most fundamental way possible. War is coming, not a border skirmish or a minor conflict, but an existential battle that will determine Zazao's future. Amina returns to Zaria and immediately convenes her war council. The discussion is somber. Her intelligence reports suggest the coalition might field an army of 40 to 50,000 warriors, roughly twice the size of Amina's available forces. They'll be invading from multiple directions, trying to divide Amina's army and overwhelm Zazo's defenses. Her generals propose various strategies: defensive warfare, allowing the enemy to exhaust themselves against Zazo's walls; diplomatic overtures, trying to peel off members of the coalition with offers of favorable terms; even a radical suggestion to abandon the outer territories and consolidate around Zaria itself. Amina rejects all of these. Instead, she proposes something that shocks even her most experienced commanders, something so bold, so risky, that it could either save Zasu or destroy it completely. But what is this plan? And can even Amina's genius overcome such overwhelming odds? The answer would determine not just the fate of Zazo, but the future of an entire region. The situation is desperate. Spring of 1575. Intelligence reports flood into Zaria daily, each one more alarming than the last. The coalition forces are massing at multiple points along Zazo's borders. Kano is mobilizing its famous cavalry units. Katsina is bringing siege equipment capable of breaching even Amina's walls. Smaller states are contributing thousands of warriors, eager for a share of the spoils once Zazo falls. Amina's court is divided. Some advisors counsel submission. Perhaps Amina could negotiate terms, agree to reduce Zazo's territory, pay tribute to the coalition, even agree to step down from the throne in favor of a male relative. At least this way, Zazo itself would survive. But Amina knows better. The coalition doesn't want compromise. They want Zazo's complete destruction as a regional power. They want its trade routes, its tributary states, its wealth. And they want to make an example of the warrior queen who dared to challenge the patriarchal order of Hausa politics. Submission isn't an option. The only question is how to fight. This is where Amina reveals the plan she's been formulating, and it's audacious beyond belief. Instead of waiting for the coalition to invade, she will strike first. Not at the coalition's assembled armies. That would be suicide. Instead, she will attack the coalition's weak point, its supply lines and tributary states. The logic is ruthless, but brilliant. The coalition army is huge, yes, but huge armies require enormous resources: food, water, fodder for horses, weapons, medical supplies. All of this must flow continuously from the coalition's home territories to their forward positions. Disrupt those supply lines, and the army becomes a liability rather than an asset. Moreover, the coalition states have their own tributary kingdoms and vassal states providing resources and warriors. If Amina can flip some of these, through bribery, threats, or military action, the coalition's numerical advantage evaporates. Her generals are stunned. What Amina is proposing isn't a battle plan. It's an entire campaign strategy that attacks the enemy's political and economic infrastructure rather than its military directly. It's generations ahead of conventional military thinking, but it requires speed, coordination, and a willingness to take enormous risks. Amina divides her army into multiple fast-moving columns. The bulk of her forces remain around Zaria, creating the appearance that she's preparing for defensive warfare. But elite units, cavalry mostly, capable of covering huge distances quickly, deploy secretly to multiple locations around Zazo's borders. In late spring 1575, Amina launches her counteroffensive. A cavalry force of 3,000 warriors appears suddenly in Kano's tributary territories to the north, far from where the coalition expects any resistance. They don't attack Kano itself. The walls are too strong and the garrison too large. Instead, they systematically raid villages and towns that supply Kano with food and resources. Granaries burn. Livestock is driven off. Trade caravans are ambushed. Within weeks, Kano is facing a supply crisis. Simultaneously, another Zazao force attacks Katsina's southern territories, disrupting their supply lines and forcing Katsina to divert troops away from the planned invasion to defend their own lands. But Amina's masterstroke is her diplomatic offensive. Her emissaries fan out across the region, carrying a simple message to smaller states that have allied with the coalition. Zazo remembers its friends and punishes its enemies. States that withdraw from the coalition now will face no retribution. States that remain will be Amina's first targets once this war is over. It's psychological warfare of the highest order. The smaller states didn't join the coalition out of hostility to Zazao. They joined out of fear of Kano and Katsina, or hope of gaining some advantage. Now Amina is offering them an exit. Several states begin wavering. A few quietly send messages to Zaria pledging neutrality. The coalition leadership faces a dilemma. Their carefully planned invasion is falling apart before it even begins. Their supply lines are under attack. Their alliance is fracturing. They need a decisive victory to restore momentum and unity. In midsummer 1575, the coalition finally launches its invasion. A massive army, estimates suggest around 40,000 warriors after some allies withdrew, advances on Zaria from the north and west simultaneously. The coalition commanders are confident. Even with Amina's disruptions, they still outnumber Zazao's defending forces. They have siege equipment. They have experienced generals. They have righteous anger at Zazao's arrogance. Amina lets them come. The coalition army finds Zazao's outer territories largely abandoned. Villages are empty, granaries destroyed or emptied, wells poisoned. Amina has implemented a scorched earth policy. Anything that could supply the invading army has been removed or destroyed. The coalition must carry all its supplies with it, stretching their already stressed logistics even further. When the coalition forces finally reach the first major fortified settlement, one of Amina's wall-protected towns about 3 days' march from Zaria itself, they prepare for a lengthy siege. The walls are formidable, and intelligence suggests a significant garrison inside. The siege begins. Coalition forces surround the settlement, bring up siege equipment, and prepare for a prolonged assault. Days pass, then weeks. The garrison refuses to surrender. Coalition forces launch assault after assault, each one repulsed with heavy casualties. And then the garrison disappears. Under cover of darkness, using underground tunnels Amina's engineers had constructed for exactly this purpose, the defenders evacuate the settlement completely. When coalition forces finally breach the walls and storm inside, they find an empty town. No supplies, no defenders, nothing of value. They've spent weeks and thousands of casualties capturing literally nothing. It's humiliating and demoralizing. Worse, it's revealed Amina's strategy. She never intended to defend the outer territories in conventional sieges. She intended to bleed the coalition through a war of attrition, forcing them to expend resources attacking empty fortifications, while her cavalry harassed their supply lines. The coalition leadership faces a terrible choice. Press on toward Zaria itself, knowing that supply shortages are becoming critical, or withdraw and face political disaster at home. They choose to press on. It's exactly what Amina wants. By the time coalition forces reach Zaria itself in late summer, they're exhausted, undersupplied, and demoralized. They've been marching and fighting for months. Casualties from Amina's raids and the sieges of empty fortifications have been significant. Disease is spreading through their camps due to poor sanitation and limited food. The coalition that started with 40,000 warriors now musters perhaps 30,000 combat-effective troops. And they're facing Zaria's walls, the most formidable fortifications in Hausa land. Amina has spent weeks preparing. Her full army, approximately 20,000 warriors, is concentrated in and around the capital. Fresh troops, well-fed, fighting on familiar ground, with their backs to their homes and families. The walls have been reinforced. Every approach has been fortified. Supplies to withstand a siege of many months have been stockpiled. But Amina doesn't plan to wait for a siege. The coalition establishes camps around Zaria, preparing for a prolonged assault. Their commanders know they can't simply storm the walls. That would result in catastrophic casualties. They need to methodically reduce the defenses, bring up siege equipment, starve out the defenders. On the third night of the siege, Amina strikes. She launches a night raid in force, 10,000 warriors pouring out of Zaria's gates in a coordinated assault on the coalition's camps. The attack comes from multiple directions simultaneously, exploiting gaps in the coalition's perimeter that Amina's scouts had identified. The coalition forces, exhausted and not expecting aggression from defenders, are thrown into chaos. The battle that follows is brutal and confused. In darkness, fighting dissolves into dozens of small skirmishes. Coalition commanders struggle to organize a coherent defense. Some units fight effectively, others panic and flee. The carefully planned siege dissolves into a melee that favors Zazao's fresh, well-led warriors. By dawn, the coalition's camps are in ruins. Thousands of coalition warriors are dead or captured. Crucial siege equipment has been destroyed. Most importantly, the coalition's remaining supply wagons, containing desperately needed food and weapons, have been captured or burned. The coalition army is broken. What follows is less a battle than a rout. Coalition forces begin withdrawing in disorder. Some units maintain discipline and conduct fighting retreats. Others simply flee, abandoning equipment and wounded comrades. Amina's cavalry pursue relentlessly, turning withdrawal into catastrophe. By the time surviving coalition forces struggle back to their home territories, they've lost more than half their original strength. Kano has suffered thousands of casualties. Katsina's famous cavalry units are shattered. Smaller states that contributed warriors face the political consequences of a disastrous military adventure. The coalition war is over. Zazao has won a victory so complete, so overwhelming, that it will be remembered for generations. But Amina doesn't stop there. In the aftermath of victory, while her enemies are reeling and disorganized, she launches a series of punitive campaigns. Territories that supported the coalition face Zazo's retribution. Some are conquered outright and absorbed into Amina's growing domain. Others are forced to pay massive indemnities and provide hostages as guarantees of future loyalty. Kano and Katsina, the coalition's leaders, are forced to negotiate peace treaties that are humiliating in their terms. They must recognize Zazao's dominance. They must open their markets to Zazao's merchants on favorable terms. They must pay tribute, not as formal vassals, but as gifts that everyone understands are actually protection payments. The balance of power in Houseland has fundamentally shifted. Before the coalition war, Zazo was powerful, but still one state among several. After the war, Zazo is unmistakably dominant. Amina's authority extends across territories that dwarf those of any previous Hausa ruler. But here's what makes Amina truly remarkable as a ruler. She doesn't simply crush her defeated enemies. She understands that stable power requires not just military dominance, but political legitimacy and economic prosperity. In the years immediately following the coalition war, roughly 1576 to 1578, Amina implements a series of policies designed to transform her military conquests into lasting political authority. First, she invests heavily in infrastructure. Trade routes across her territories are improved and protected. Merchant caravans traveling through Zazo's lands enjoy security unprecedented in the region. This attracts more trade, which brings more wealth, which funds more military and infrastructure development in a virtuous cycle. Second, she establishes a more systematic administrative structure. Previously, Zazo's territorial control was somewhat ad hoc. Conquered territories paid tribute, but otherwise governed themselves. Now Amina creates a more formalized system. Governors receive clear instructions on tax collection, justice administration, and military obligations. Regular inspections ensure compliance. It's the beginning of what might have evolved into a true bureaucratic state, rather than just a collection of tributary territories. Third, she cultivates relationships with Islamic scholars and institutions. Amina is a practicing Muslim, and she understands that religious legitimacy is crucial for maintaining authority. She funds the construction of mosques. She supports Islamic education. She presents herself not as a revolutionary overturning tradition, but as a pious Muslim ruler who happens to be female, a distinction that makes her rule more palatable to traditionalists. Fourth, and perhaps most importantly, she secures trade relationships beyond Hausaland. Zazao under Amina begins trading directly with North African kingdoms and city-states. Caravans from Zaria travel to Tripoli, Cairo, and other Mediterranean ports. Trade goods from Zaza appear in markets from Morocco to Egypt. This isn't just economically beneficial, it's politically crucial. By integrating Zaza into trans-Saharan trade networks at the highest level, Amina makes her kingdom indispensable. Other states can't afford to isolate or destroy Zaza without disrupting trade routes that benefit everyone. By 1578, Zaza, under Amina's rule, is at its zenith. The kingdom controls territories estimated at over 30,000 square miles, a substantial empire by West African standards. The population under Amina's authority might number in the hundreds of thousands, perhaps approaching 500,000. Zaria itself has grown into a major city, its markets overflowing with goods from across Africa and the Mediterranean world. Amina's personal wealth is legendary. She owns vast estates, herds of horses and cattle, and slaves by the thousands. She dresses in the finest imported silks and wears jewelry of gold and precious stones. Her court rivals those of the great Islamic empires in sophistication and luxury. But Amina hasn't gone soft. She maintains her military readiness. Her army remains one of the most formidable in West Africa. She continues to lead campaigns personally, refusing to become a distant figurehead. In her mid-40s by this point, Amina is still riding at the head of her cavalry, still making tactical decisions on battlefields, still commanding the absolute loyalty of her warriors. The Amina walls continue to spread. Wherever Zaza's authority extends, fortifications appear. These walls serve military purposes, certainly, but they're also symbols, visible reminders that Zaza's power is permanent, built into the landscape itself. 500 years later, archaeologists and historians will study these walls, marveling at their extent and sophistication. But as the 1570s give way to the 1580s, Amina faces new challenges. Not military threats, she's thoroughly dominated her immediate neighbors. Instead, she faces the challenges of success: how to maintain an empire built on military conquest, how to ensure succession when she has no children, how to adapt to a changing world where European influence in West Africa is slowly but inexorably growing. And there's something else, something that Amina perhaps doesn't fully recognize yet. She's getting older. The years of constant campaigning, the stress of ruling, the physical toll of warfare, all of it is accumulating. She's still formidable, still brilliant, but she's no longer the young warrior princess who first seized power. The question hanging over Zaza in the early 1580s is one that Amina herself must be contemplating. What happens when she's gone? She has no children. She's refused to marry. She's built an empire, but empires built around a single charismatic leader often collapse when that leader dies. Zaza's stability depends entirely on Amina's personal authority. Remove her, and what's left? Amina begins making preparations for succession. She elevates certain military commanders and administrators, clearly grooming them for leadership. She strengthens the institutional structures of government, trying to ensure that Zaza can function even without her direct oversight. She cultivates loyalty not just to herself personally, but to Zaza as a concept, as a political entity that transcends any individual ruler. But she also knows that ultimately, succession planning only goes so far. When she dies, there will be a power struggle. It's inevitable. The only question is whether Zaza's institutions and the loyalties she's built will be strong enough to survive that struggle intact. In the meantime, Amina continues to rule with the same energy and brilliance that has characterized her entire reign. She leads military expeditions into the mid-1580s. She personally oversees major construction projects. She adjudicates disputes brought before her court. She's not a ruler who delegates and disappears into palace luxury. She's hands-on, engaged, constantly visible to her people, and she continues to build her legend. Stories about Amina spread far beyond Hausa. Trans-Saharan merchants carry tales of the warrior queen to North Africa and beyond. Islamic scholars write about her in their chronicles, sometimes praising her piety and justice, sometimes questioning whether a woman can legitimately rule. European traders beginning to establish themselves on the West African coast hear rumors of a powerful inland kingdom ruled by a woman warrior. But what these distant observers don't fully understand is that Amina isn't just a military conqueror or a political leader. She's transformed an entire region. The security she's established allows trade to flourish in ways it never could when the Hausa states were constantly fighting among themselves. The infrastructure she's built, walls, roads, market towns, will outlast her by centuries. The administrative systems she's developed will influence how future West African states are organized. Amina has created something that transcends her own remarkable life. She's proven that women can rule, can conquer, can build empires as effectively as any man. In a world that systematically denies women access to power, Amina has kicked open a door and demonstrated what's possible. But history, as Amina knows better than most, is cruel and unpredictable. Even the greatest rulers eventually face their final challenge. And for Amina, that challenge is approaching faster than anyone realizes. The year is 1586. Amina has ruled Zazzau for 21 years, an extraordinarily long reign by any standard, but especially for a medieval African monarch whose authority rests primarily on military power. She's in her mid-50s, an advanced age for someone who has spent decades campaigning in harsh climates, fighting in battles, and enduring the constant stress of ruling. But Amina shows no signs of slowing down. Intelligence reaches Zaria of a new threat forming in the west. The Nupe Kingdom, a powerful state that has remained largely independent of Amina's authority, is expanding its own influence, potentially threatening trade routes that Zazzau depends on. The Nupe have been growing wealthy from trade with European merchants on the coast, acquiring new weapons including some early firearms, and building a military force that could potentially challenge Zazzau's dominance. Amina's advisors urge caution. The Nupe are not some minor kingdom to be easily conquered. They're a sophisticated state with their own military traditions and considerable resources. Moreover, a campaign into Nupe territory would require marching through difficult terrain, crossing rivers, and fighting far from Zazzau's bases of support. And there's the unspoken concern. Is Amina still capable of leading such a campaign? She's been fortunate to avoid serious injury in decades of warfare, but age eventually defeats every warrior. Perhaps this is a campaign that should be led by younger generals while Amina directs strategy from Zaria. Amina's response is characteristically direct. She will lead the campaign personally as she always has. To do otherwise would signal weakness, would invite challenges from rivals who might see an aging queen as vulnerable. More importantly, it would betray everything she's built her reign on: personal leadership, courage, visibility. In late 1586 or early 1587, Amina leads an army westward toward Nupe territory. It's a substantial force, perhaps 15,000 warriors, but not the massive armies she commanded in earlier campaigns. Zazzau's military is stretched, maintaining control over its vast territories. She can't strip garrisons from other regions without risking rebellion or invasion. The campaign begins well enough. Smaller states between Zazzau and Nupe quickly submit, either through diplomatic pressure or limited military action. Amina's reputation precedes her. Most rulers would rather pledge allegiance and pay tribute than face her army in battle. But as Amina's forces penetrate deeper into the region, they encounter more determined resistance. The Nupe have been preparing. They've formed alliances with smaller kingdoms in the region. They've positioned defensive forces at key river crossings and mountain passes. They're not going to submit without a fight. The first major engagement occurs at a river crossing defended by Nupe forces. It's eerily similar to Amina's early victory against the Quararafa decades earlier, a defensive position that must be overcome to continue the advance. Amina employs similar tactics: feints, multiple crossing points, coordination between different parts of her army. But this time, the Nupe are ready. They've studied Amina's tactics from previous campaigns. They anticipate the feints and have reserves positioned to respond to multiple crossing attempts. The battle is fierce and costly. Zazzau forces eventually secure the crossing, but casualties are higher than in any engagement Amina has fought in years. Worse, the Nupe forces conduct an organized retreat rather than routing. They'll be able to regroup and fight again. It's a warning sign that this campaign will be different from Amina's previous conquests. Over the following months, Amina's army advances slowly through Nupe territory. Each river, each fortified town, each mountain pass is contested. The Nupe are fighting a smart defensive war, avoiding large-scale battles they might lose while inflicting steady casualties through ambushes, raids, and defense of strong positions. Amina's supply lines are stretched thin. The scorched earth tactics that worked so well against the coalition invasion now work against her. The Nupe have destroyed crops and driven off livestock, forcing Amina's army to carry all its supplies. Disease begins to spread through her camps. Morale, while still strong due to Amina's personal presence and legendary reputation, is not what it once was. And then in mid-1587, disaster nearly strikes. Amina is personally leading a reconnaissance with a cavalry unit when they're ambushed by a much larger Nupe force. It's a well-planned trap. The Nupe have been tracking Amina's movements and set up an ambush specifically targeting her. The fighting is desperate in close quarters. Amina's cavalry is outnumbered 3-1. For the first time in decades, Amina is in genuine danger of being killed or captured. Her personal guards form a protective ring around her, fighting with desperate fury to keep the Nupe warriors at bay. For several terrifying minutes, the fate of Zazao hangs in the balance. If Amina falls here, in an ambush in enemy territory far from help, her empire could collapse into civil war within weeks. The commanders waiting for news back at the main camp include several who would immediately declare themselves her successor. The unity she's built over 2 decades could shatter, but Amina survives. Her guards, fighting with the desperation of men who know their own fates depend on their queen's survival, manage to cut a path through the Nupe forces. Reinforcements from the main cavalry unit arrive. The Nupe, having failed to capture or kill Amina, withdraw before they're overwhelmed by Zasao's superior numbers. Amina returns to camp with several wounds, none life-threatening, but serious enough that she needs days to recover. It's a sobering moment. For the first time, Amina and her commanders must confront the reality that she is not invincible, that age and the accumulated toll of decades of warfare have made her vulnerable in ways she never was as a younger woman. The campaign against the Nupe continues, but its character changes. Amina's commanders insist, and she reluctantly agrees, that she no longer personally lead reconnaissance missions or place herself in the most dangerous combat situations. It's a compromise that pains her deeply. She's built her authority on personal courage and visibility. To pull back, even slightly, feels like the beginning of the end. But she's pragmatic enough to recognize necessity. Over the remainder of 1587 and into 1588, Amina's forces gradually wear down Nupe resistance. It's not the swift, decisive campaigns of her youth, but rather a grinding war of attrition. Town by town, river crossing by river crossing, Zazao advances. The Nupe fight bravely, but ultimately they lack the resources and manpower to match Zazao's military machine. By late 1588, the Nupe leadership sues for peace. The terms are favorable to Zazao: trade agreements, tribute payments, acknowledgement of Amina's suzerainty. But it's not unconditional surrender. The Nupe retain their kingdom and much of their autonomy. It's a compromise that reflects the reality of the campaign. Amina has won, but at a higher cost than she's accustomed to paying. The army returns to Zaria in early 1589. They receive a hero's welcome, as always. Amina rides at the head of the procession, looking every inch the conquering queen. But those who know her well notice changes. She moves more stiffly. She looks tired in ways she never did before. The wounds from the ambush have healed, but they've left their mark. Amina is approaching 60 years old, an extraordinary age for a medieval warrior. She's ruled for nearly a quarter century. She's conducted more campaigns than most military leaders attempt in a lifetime. She's built an empire that dominates an entire region. And now, finally, she begins to acknowledge what everyone around her has known for years. She won't live forever. Zazao needs to prepare for her eventual death. The final years of Amina's reign, from 1589 to her death, are characterized less by military campaigns and more by efforts to secure her legacy. She continues to govern actively, but her focus shifts to institutional development, succession planning, and ensuring that Zazao can survive without her. She elevates several commanders to positions of great authority, clearly positioning them as potential successors. She strengthens alliances with neighboring states through diplomacy rather than conquest. She invests in projects that will outlast her, mosques, markets, fortifications, roads. There's a sense in these final years of Amina trying to transform her personal authority into institutional power. She knows that charismatic leadership dies with the leader. She's trying to create structures, traditions, and loyalties that will endure. But she also knows that ultimately, succession will be decided by power, military force, political alliances, the loyalty of key factions. All she can do is try to create conditions where the transition might be relatively peaceful and Zazo's core territories remain intact. In her final campaigns, smaller expeditions to put down rebellions or intimidate restive tributary states, Amina no longer leads from the front lines. She directs strategy from the capital or from well-protected positions near the fighting. It's a necessary compromise, but one that erodes her mystique slightly. The warrior queen is becoming simply the queen. Contemporary accounts from this period, fragmentary as they are, describe Amina as still formidable, but clearly aging. She moves with the aid of attendants. She suffers from ailments common to people who have spent decades campaigning in harsh climates, probably chronic pain from old injuries, possibly respiratory issues from years of exposure to smoke and dust. But her mind remains sharp. Visitors to her court describe a ruler who is still very much in command, who discusses military strategy with clarity, who remembers details of events decades past, who can still intimidate subordinates with a glance and inspire loyalty with her presence. The exact date of Amina's death is lost to history. Different sources give different years, ranging from 1610 to as late as 1617. Most modern historians place it around 1610, which would make Amina approximately 77 years old, an extraordinary lifespan for the era. The most persistent tradition regarding her death places it during yet another military campaign. According to this account, Amina insisted on personally leading one final expedition, despite her advanced age and failing health. She died not in palace luxury, but in a military camp, still trying to expand or defend her kingdom, still refusing to accept that age had finally defeated her, where no enemy could. If true, it's an ending that would have pleased her, a warrior's death on campaign, serving Zazo to her final breath. But what happened after her death would prove whether everything she built could survive without her. If you've made it this far into the story of Queen Amina, you're clearly someone who appreciates history told the way it should be. Immersive, detailed, and absolutely gripping. This channel is dedicated to bringing you more incredible stories like this one, diving deep into the lives of historical figures who deserve to be as famous as any European monarch or ancient conqueror. So if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and join a community of people who believe history should never be boring. There's so much more to explore together. Now let's return to Zaria, to the aftermath of Amina's death, and to the question that will determine her true legacy. The death of a monarch who has ruled for decades, who has built an empire through personal charisma and military genius, who has no clear heir. This is a recipe for disaster. When news of Amina's death reaches Zaria, the city goes into mourning. But beneath the public grief, a ruthless political calculation begins. Multiple factions, each with their own candidate for the throne, start positioning for power. The military commanders who served under Amina are the most obvious contenders. They have troops loyal to them personally, they have experience governing territories, they have the respect of the warrior class. But they're also rivals who have spent years competing for Amina's favor. Now that she's gone, old jealousies and ambitions resurface. There are also members of the royal family, distant relatives of Amina, who have legitimate blood claims to the throne, even if they lack her military genius or political acumen. Some nobles support these candidates, seeing them as more traditional, more manageable than the ambitious generals. And then there are external threats. Neighboring kingdoms that submitted to Amina's authority but never truly accepted it see her death as an opportunity. If Zazo descends into civil war, they might be able to reclaim independence or even expand at Zazo's expense. The weeks following Amina's death are tense. Different factions jockey for position. Military units are moved to strategic locations. Alliances are formed and broken. Violence seems inevitable. But then something remarkable happens. Something that speaks to Amina's true legacy. The commanders and nobles of Zazao, after intense negotiations, reach a compromise. They select a new ruler, not one of the most powerful military commanders, which would have created intense resentment among the others, and not a weak royal figurehead, which would have left Zazao vulnerable. Instead, they choose someone competent, relatively neutral, and acceptable to most factions. The new Sarki faces immediate challenges. Several tributary states, sensing weakness, declare independence. Neighboring kingdoms test Zazao's defenses with border raids. Internal rivals plot to overthrow the new ruler and claim power for themselves. But, and this is crucial, Zazao doesn't collapse. The institutions Amina built, the administrative structures she established, the network of fortifications and garrisons she created, the trade relationships she cultivated, all of these survive her death. They provide continuity, stability, even as political leadership changes. The Amina walls in particular prove their worth. When tributary states rebel, they find themselves facing fortifications that make reconquest extremely difficult. When neighboring kingdoms invade, they encounter a defensive network that Amina designed specifically to protect Zazao's core territories. The walls buy time for Zazao's army to mobilize and respond to threats. Moreover, the military culture Amina created persists. The warriors who served under her don't suddenly forget their training or lose their discipline. The cavalry tactics she developed continue to be employed. The emphasis on fortification, on controlling trade routes, on systematic administration, all of these become standard practice for Zazao's rulers. Over the next several years following Amina's death, Zazao experiences what historians would recognize as a managed decline. The empire Amina built proves too large to maintain without her personal authority. Distant territories break away. The extent of Zazao's direct control shrinks back closer to its historical core around Zaria itself. But, and this is the key point, Zazao itself survives as a major power. It doesn't collapse into civil war. It doesn't get conquered by rivals. It continues to be one of the major Hausa city-states, continuing to play an important role in West African politics and trade for centuries. This is Amina's true achievement. She didn't just conquer territories. She built institutions and systems that outlasted her. She didn't just win battles. She created a military culture and defensive infrastructure that protected Zazao even after her death. She didn't just accumulate power, she legitimized women's authority in ways that influenced how future generations thought about leadership and capability. The historical record of the decades immediately after Amina's death is frustratingly sparse. We know that Zazao continued to be ruled by a series of leaders, some more capable than others. We know that the kingdom maintained its independence and importance. We know that trade continued to flow through Zaria, that the walls continued to protect its territories, that the military traditions Amina established continued to be honored. But we've lost the details, the names of specific rulers, the exact boundaries of territories, the particular military campaigns. History, particularly African history from this period, is full of these gaps where oral traditions fade and written records are incomplete or lost. What we do know with certainty is this. The Amina walls, many of which still stand today, over 400 years later, remain as physical testimony to her reign. Archaeologists have mapped extensive networks of these fortifications across northern Nigeria. The walls are sophisticated earthwork constructions, some with bases 20 feet thick and heights of over 20 feet. They represent hundreds of thousands of hours of labor, coordinated engineering on a massive scale, and a vision of territorial defense that was generations ahead of its time. Modern visitors to Zaria can still see portions of these walls. They've eroded over centuries, have been built over in some places, have been destroyed by urban development. But they persist, stubborn monuments to a queen whose name was nearly forgotten, but whose physical achievements literally reshaped the landscape. And there's another legacy, one harder to quantify, but perhaps even more important. Amina proved what women could achieve in a world designed to constrain them. In the centuries after her death, her story was preserved in oral traditions, in songs sung by griots, in tales told to children. These stories varied in details. Some portrayed her as almost superhuman, others focused on her romantic exploits. Still others emphasized her piety and justice. but all agreed on the core fact. A woman ruled Zazao, built an empire, commanded armies, and earned a place among the greatest leaders in Hausa history. This mattered. It provided a counter-narrative to the patriarchal assumptions that dominated most societies. It demonstrated that women's exclusion from power was a choice, not a necessity. It inspired and continues to inspire girls and women who hear her story to imagine possibilities beyond the roles society assigns them. In 1975, over 350 years after Amina's death, the Nigerian government issued a series of stamps honoring historical figures who shaped the nation. One of those stamps featured Queen Amina of Zaria, sword in hand, leading her warriors. It was an acknowledgement, however belated, that her achievements deserved to be remembered and celebrated. Today, statues of Amina stand in Zaria and Lagos. Schools and streets are named after her. She's featured in Nigerian textbooks as a symbol of pre-colonial African achievement and female empowerment. Scholars debate the details of her life, trying to separate historical fact from legend. But here's the remarkable thing. Whether every story about Amina is literally true or not almost doesn't matter. What matters is that she existed, that she ruled, that she conquered, and that 5 centuries later, people still know her name and draw inspiration from her example. In a just world, Queen Amina of Zaria would be as famous as Joan of Arc, as celebrated as Elizabeth of France, as studied as Alexander the Great. She built an empire that rivaled European kingdoms in size. She developed military tactics that were innovative for her era. She ruled for decades with a combination of strategic brilliance and political acumen that few leaders of any gender have matched. The fact that most people have never heard of her speaks to the systematic erasure of African history, to the biases that have shaped how we remember the past, to the assumptions about who deserves to be remembered and celebrated. But erasure is not the same as obliteration. Amina's walls still stand. Her story still circulates. Her legacy still inspires. And now you know her story. You know about the warrior princess who became a queen, who built an empire, who proved that women could lead armies and rule kingdoms as effectively as any man in history. But there's still one more chapter to this story, one that connects Amina's 16th century world to our present day. A chapter about how her legend evolved, how historians rediscovered her, and why her story matters now more than ever. For centuries after her death, Amina's story lived primarily in oral tradition. The Hausa people of northern Nigeria preserved her memory through songs, proverbs, and stories passed from generation to generation. She became a figure of folklore, not forgotten, but not quite historical either. Her achievements were remembered, but also embellished, mythologized, transformed into legend. In these traditional accounts, Amina grows larger than life. Some versions claim she was a giantess, physically dominating men through sheer size. Others suggest she possessed magical powers, that she could conjure victories through supernatural means. Still others focus on romantic and sexual exploits, claiming she took a new lover after every victory only to execute them in the morning. A narrative that says more about patriarchal anxieties about powerful women than about historical reality. These legendary accretions are common for figures who loom large in cultural memory, but lack extensive written documentation. King Arthur accumulated similar legends in Britain. Charlemagne's historical achievements were embellished with fantastical elements. It's almost a mark of historical importance. Only figures who truly mattered get transformed into legends. But legends, however entertaining, can also obscure history. By the 19th and early 20th centuries, as European colonialism dominated Africa and European historians began writing African history, Amina was often dismissed as purely mythical, a folk heroine with no historical basis, like an African version of Wonder Woman. This dismissal was convenient for colonial narratives. If Africans had never built sophisticated kingdoms, never developed complex political systems, never produced military geniuses capable of building empires, then colonialism could be justified as bringing civilization to a backward continent. Acknowledging rulers like Amina, women no less, who had built states that rivaled European kingdoms, complicated that narrative in uncomfortable ways. The systematic recovery of Amina's historical reality began in the mid-20th century. as African independence movements sparked renewed interest in pre-colonial African history. Scholars, many of them African, began the painstaking work of reconstructing the past from fragmentary sources. They turned to the Kano Chronicle, a historical document written in Arabic in the 19th century, but containing information passed down from much earlier periods. The chronicle mentions Amina, describing her as a military leader and listing some of her achievements. It provides dates, names of contemporaries, and details of campaigns. They collected and analyzed oral traditions, recognizing that while these might contain legendary elements, they also preserve genuine historical memories. By comparing different versions of stories and identifying consistent elements across accounts, scholars could begin to separate probable fact from later embellishment. They studied the Amina walls themselves, physical evidence that couldn't be dismissed as folklore. Archaeological analysis of these fortifications confirmed that they were constructed using techniques consistent with 16th century Hausa engineering. Their extent and sophistication indicated centralized authority capable of mobilizing enormous labor forces, exactly what you'd expect from a powerful ruler. They examined trade records and accounts from North African merchants who traveled trans-Saharan routes. While few mention Amina specifically, she was, after all, ruling an inland kingdom that most North African traders never visited personally. They do describe a period when Zazzau rose to prominence in regional trade, when security along certain routes improved dramatically, when wealth flowed into the Hausa region in unprecedented amounts. All of this is consistent with Amina's reign as described in Hausa sources. Slowly, painstakingly, a historical picture emerged. Not complete, there are still enormous gaps in our knowledge, but substantial enough that mainstream historians now acknowledge Amina as a genuine historical figure rather than a myth. The scholarly consensus today places her birth around 1533, her reign from approximately 1565 to her death around 1610, and her major campaigns in the 1570s and 1580s. Historians accept that she was a significant military leader who expanded Zazzau's territory, that she built extensive fortifications, and that she ruled for several decades. The more fantastical elements of her legend, the supernatural powers, the executed lovers, the claims of being 7 feet tall, are recognized as later additions. But here's what's fascinating. Even stripped of legendary embellishments, Amina's historical achievements remain extraordinary. She ruled for approximately 34 years in an era when violent overthrow of rulers was common and where women rulers were extremely rare. That alone indicates exceptional political skill. She conducted military campaigns that expanded Zazzau's territory significantly and established it as a dominant regional power. This requires strategic brilliance, tactical expertise, and the ability to inspire loyalty in warriors who might otherwise have refused to follow a female leader. She implemented infrastructure projects, the walls, that required enormous organization, resources, and vision. These weren't built overnight or on impulse. They represent systematic planning and execution over years or decades. She integrated Zazzau into trans-Saharan trade networks at the highest level, bringing unprecedented wealth to her kingdom and securing its economic future. And she did all this while navigating the prejudices and constraints of a patriarchal society that had every reason to reject her authority, but ultimately accepted and even celebrated it. The historical Amina, the real woman behind the legend, may be even more impressive than the mythical figure, precisely because her achievements were human rather than supernatural. Today, Amina's legacy is being reclaimed and celebrated in new ways. Nigerian feminists point to her as proof that African women have always been capable of leadership and achievement, that patriarchal constraints are cultural choices rather than natural inevitabilities. Pan-Africanists celebrate her as an example of pre-colonial African achievement, evidence that African societies were sophisticated, powerful, and capable of producing world-class leaders long before European contact. Artists have reimagined her story. In 2017, a Nigerian animated series called Queen Amina of Zaria introduced her to a new generation of African children. The series, while taking creative liberties, presents Amina as a role model, brave, intelligent, and principled. For young girls watching, many of whom have been taught that leadership and power are male domains, seeing a warrior queen who looks like them can be transformative. Musicians have written songs about her. Nigerian artists across multiple genres, from traditional Hausa music to Afrobeat to hip-hop, have referenced Amina in their lyrics, using her as a symbol of strength, independence, and African pride. Scholars continue to research her life, hoping to uncover new sources that might fill in the gaps in our knowledge. Archaeological expeditions map the extent of the Amina walls, using modern surveying technology to understand their full scope. Historians comb through archives in North Africa and the Middle East, searching for any contemporary accounts that might mention Zaza during her reign. But perhaps most significantly, Amina has entered the global conversation about historical women who have been overlooked or forgotten. She appears in books and documentaries about female warriors and rulers. She's taught in some world history courses as an example of pre-colonial African political systems. She's discussed in feminist spaces as proof that women's exclusion from power is not universal or inevitable. There's also growing recognition that the erasure of figures like Amina from mainstream historical consciousness is not accidental. It reflects centuries of bias in which European history was treated as world history, in which African achievements were systematically downplayed or ignored, and in which women's contributions were marginalized regardless of their actual impact. The rediscovery and celebration of Amina is part of a larger project of decolonizing history, of recognizing that human achievement, innovation, and greatness have emerged from all cultures and that our understanding of the past has been distorted by the biases of those who wrote it down. Consider this. When we think of medieval empires, most people immediately imagine European kingdoms or perhaps the Islamic caliphates. Few think of the sophisticated West African states, Mali, Songhai, the Hausa kingdoms, that controlled vast territories, facilitated international trade, and developed complex political and cultural systems. When we think of great military leaders, names like Alexander, Caesar, Napoleon, and Genghis Khan dominate. But how many people can name even one pre-colonial African military leader? Not because such leaders didn't exist, they absolutely did, but because their stories haven't been told with the same prominence. And when we think of women warriors and rulers throughout history, we might recall Joan of Arc, Boudica, or perhaps Elizabeth I or Catherine the Great. But these are almost exclusively European figures. The assumption, often unstated, is that powerful women were rare oddities in history, and those who did emerge were products of uniquely progressive cultures. Amina challenges all of these assumptions. She proves that medieval Africa produced military geniuses equal to any in the world. She demonstrates that women in the 16th century could and did command armies, build empires, and rule with the same complexity of any male monarch. She shows that African history is world history, that it deserves the same serious study and celebration as European or Asian history. But here's what's truly remarkable. Despite centuries of neglect, despite the systematic bias against African history and women's history, Amina's story survived. It survived in oral traditions when written records were lost or never created. It survived in the physical landscape through the walls she built. It survived in the cultural memory of the Hausa people who never forgot their warrior queen. And now in the 21st century, as we're finally beginning to tell a more complete and honest version of human history, Amina's story is reaching a global audience. Children in Nigeria learn about her in school. Feminists worldwide cite her as inspiration. Historians study her reign as a case study in female political authority and pre-colonial African state building. There's a beautiful irony here. Amina fought to build an empire that would outlast her, to create institutions and structures that would survive her death. That empire, in its political and territorial sense, didn't last. Within decades of her death, much of what she conquered had broken away. Within a century, Zazu was just one house estate among several again. But her true legacy, her demonstration that women could rule, that African kingdoms could rival any in the world, that one determined, brilliant individual could reshape an entire region, that legacy has proven far more durable than any political empire. 5 centuries after her death, Amina of Zaria remains a warrior, still fighting, not with sword and cavalry anymore, but through her story, through her example, through the inspiration she provides to everyone who hears about her, and realizes that history is larger, more diverse, and more magnificent than they were taught. Her walls may crumble eventually, worn away by weather and time, but the wall she broke down, the one that said women couldn't lead armies, couldn't rule kingdoms, couldn't build empires, that wall is still falling, and Amina helped start its destruction. You might be wondering, why does the story of a 16th century West African queen matter in the 21st century? We live in a radically different world, democratic rather than monarchical, globally connected rather than regionally isolated, where gender equality is at least theoretically recognized even if not yet fully achieved. What can a medieval warrior queen possibly teach us today? The answer is everything. First, Amina's story matters because representation matters. For centuries, history as taught in schools and portrayed in popular media has been overwhelmingly centered on Europe and on men. This creates a distorted picture of human capability and achievement. It suggests, implicitly or explicitly, that certain groups, Europeans, men, Western cultures, are naturally superior because they're the ones who've accomplished great things throughout history. But this is demonstrably false. What's actually true is that certain groups have had more power to record their own histories and broadcast them to the world. African achievements were often dismissed as primitive or ignored entirely by European historians. Women's contributions were systematically erased or attributed to men. The history we inherited is not an objective record of what happened. It's a selective narrative shaped by power structures and biases. Amina's story disrupts this narrative. Here is an African woman in the 16th century, a period we're often taught was Europe's age of discovery and renaissance, who built an empire, commanded armies of 20,000 warriors, constructed fortifications across thousands of square miles, and ruled successfully for over 3 decades. She wasn't an exception who succeeded despite her background. She was a product of sophisticated West African political and military cultures that produced many capable leaders. For African people, particularly African women and girls, knowing that someone like Amina existed and achieved what she did provides a different lens through which to view themselves and their heritage. It counters the colonial narratives that suggested Africa had no history worth studying before Europeans arrived. It provides role models and inspiration from within African culture rather than requiring African people to look exclusively to European or American figures. For non-African people, Amina's story should prompt uncomfortable questions. What else don't we know about African history? How many other figures like Amina have been forgotten or dismissed? What distortions exist in our understanding of the past because we've relied primarily on European sources and perspectives? Second, Amina's story illuminates the relationship between gender and power in ways that remain relevant today. Amina didn't succeed by being one of the guys or by denying her gender. She succeeded by being exceptionally competent at every aspect of rulership: military strategy, political maneuvering, economic policy, diplomatic relations. She demanded to be judged by her abilities rather than her gender, and over time she converted skeptics through demonstrated excellence. But she also faced obstacles specifically because she was a woman. She couldn't rely on traditional paths to power like male heirs. She faced pressure to marry that male rulers didn't. She had to prove herself in ways that men in similar positions didn't. And she had to maintain her authority while navigating a society that had deeply ingrained assumptions about gender roles. This mirrors challenges that women leaders face today. Study after study shows that women in leadership positions are held to higher standards than men, that their competence is questioned more readily, that their authority is challenged more frequently. Women have to be exceptional to be seen as merely equal to mediocre men. Amina's response: relentless competence, visible achievement, building institutional power rather than relying solely on personal authority, remains a relevant model. But her story also highlights the cost. She apparently never married, never had children, spent decades in military camps rather than enjoying royal luxury, and worked until she literally died on campaign. We can celebrate her achievements while also acknowledging that the barriers she faced shouldn't have existed, and that her story doesn't mean women should have to make such sacrifices to be taken seriously as leaders. Third, Amina's story demonstrates the importance of infrastructure and institutions in building lasting power. Amina could have been content with military conquests alone, defeating enemies, extracting tribute, enjoying the spoils of victory. Many conquerors throughout history have taken this approach, but conquests without consolidation are temporary. Empires built purely on military might collapse when the conqueror dies or when military fortunes turn. Amina understood this. That's why she built the walls, not just as military defenses, but as permanent statements of Zazao's control over territory. That's why she developed administrative systems to govern conquered territories. That's why she invested in trade infrastructure and diplomatic relationships. Her approach, building institutions and systems that outlast individual leaders, is the foundation of any stable government or organization. It's the difference between movements that collapse when their charismatic founder departs and organizations that continue for generations. It's a lesson that applies to everything from nations to businesses to social movements. Fourth, Amina's story reveals the complexity of historical morality and the dangers of presentism. By modern standards, much of what Amina did would be considered morally problematic or even horrific. She conquered other kingdoms, suppressing their independence. She extracted tribute through threat of force. Her empire almost certainly participated in the slave trade, which was a standard practice across medieval Africa, the Middle East, and Europe. Her military campaigns resulted in thousands of deaths. We should acknowledge these aspects of her reign honestly. Amina was a product of her time, operating according to the norms and values of 16th century West Africa. Conquest was how states expanded and secured resources. Slavery was a universal institution that wouldn't seriously be challenged until the 18th and 19th centuries. Military force was the basis of political authority. To judge historical figures solely by contemporary moral standards is to fundamentally misunderstand history. It flattens complex human beings into simple heroes or villains. It prevents us from appreciating their achievements within their own context. And it often reflects a kind of temporal arrogance, the assumption that we, living in the 21st century, have finally figured out how to live morally, while all previous generations were morally benighted. The more productive approach is to understand Amina within her historical context, recognizing both her remarkable achievements and the moral limitations of her era, while also thinking critically about how her story can inform our own time. We can admire her strategic brilliance without endorsing conquest. We can celebrate her breaking of gender barriers without ignoring the aspects of her rule that we now recognize as unjust. Fifth, and perhaps most importantly, Amina's story is a reminder that history is not a simple march of progress from primitive past to enlightened present. The 16th century Hausa kingdoms were not less developed than 16th century Europe in any meaningful sense. They had different technologies and different cultural practices, certainly, but they were comparably sophisticated in their political organization, military capabilities, economic systems, and cultural achievements. In some respects, urban planning, trade networks, religious tolerance, they may have been more advanced than many European kingdoms of the same era. The fact that Europe eventually colonized Africa had more to do with specific historical contingencies. Europe's development of ocean-going naval technology, the economic power derived from American colonization, the disease environment that favored Europeans in certain contexts, than with any inherent European superiority. Amina's story exists in a version of the world where African kingdoms were powerful, sophisticated, and capable of producing leaders who could match anyone in the world. She ruled during a period when it was far from obvious that Europe would eventually dominate Africa. In her lifetime, the Ottoman Empire was arguably the world's most powerful state. The Songhai Empire in West Africa controlled territories larger than Western Europe. China under the Ming Dynasty was wealthy and technologically advanced. European kingdoms were important regional powers, but they weren't yet the dominant global force they would become in the 18th and 19th centuries. Understanding this, seeing Amina not as a curiosity from a primitive past, but as a leader operating in a sophisticated 16th century world that looked very different from what European-centered history has taught us, fundamentally changes how we understand global history in contemporary global relations. On a hilltop overlooking the modern city of Zaria, portions of an ancient wall still stand. The red earth has been worn by centuries of rain and wind. Trees grow through gaps in the fortification. Modern buildings have been constructed nearby, incorporating some sections of the wall into their foundations. But the wall endures. It's one of thousands of kilometers of fortifications that once protected Zazao's territories. Most have eroded or been destroyed by urban development. But enough remain that you can still trace the extent of Amina's empire, still see the physical evidence of her vision and her determination. Local people call them the Amina Walls, and they're right to do so. These walls are her monument, more lasting than any statue, more meaningful than any written chronicle. Because here's the thing about Amina that makes her truly extraordinary. She wasn't supposed to succeed. As a woman in a patriarchal society, she wasn't supposed to lead armies. As a ruler in a region of competing kingdoms, she wasn't supposed to build an empire. As an African leader in an era when African achievements would be systematically erased from historical consciousness, her story wasn't supposed to survive. But she led armies anyway. She built an empire anyway. Her story survived anyway. Not because she was superhuman or magical or different from other women who faced similar constraints, but because she was brilliant, determined, politically astute, militarily gifted, and absolutely unwilling to accept the limitations that society tried to impose on her. She looked at a world that told her she couldn't do something and said, "Watch me." She led warriors who had been taught that women were weak into battle after battle, proving through victory after victory that competence and courage have nothing to do with gender. She built walls that would outlast empires, that would still be standing 5 centuries after her death, that would still bear her name long after the kingdom she fought against had faded into historical footnotes. She created a legend so powerful that it survived centuries of colonial bias, historical erasure, and systematic marginalization of African and women's history. And now in the 21st century, Queen Amina of Zaria is finally receiving the recognition she deserves. Not as a mythical figure or a folk legend, but as a genuine historical person who achieved extraordinary things, who shaped the history of an entire region, and whose legacy continues to inspire people around the world. Her walls may eventually crumble to dust. The details of her campaigns may fade from memory. The exact dates and names may be lost to time. But the essential truth of her story, that a woman in 16th century West Africa built an empire, commanded armies, ruled for decades, and earned a place among history's greatest leaders, that truth is now part of the permanent record. It can't be erased. It can't be denied. It can't be forgotten. Queen Amina of Zaria, warrior, conqueror, builder, leader, legend. She rode at the head of 20,000 warriors. She conquered territories that would become nations. She built walls that still stand after 500 years. And she proved once and for all that history belongs to everyone, not just to those who have had the power to write it down, but to everyone who has lived it, shaped it, and left their mark upon the world. Her story is African history. It's women's history. It's military history. It's political history. But most of all, it's human history. A reminder that human potential has no boundaries except those we artificially impose. That greatness can emerge from any culture, in any gender, and that the past is far richer, far more diverse, and far more inspiring than we've been taught to believe. The warrior princess became a queen. The queen became an empire builder. The empire builder became a legend. And the legend, 5 centuries later, is still teaching us lessons about courage, capability, and the power of refusing to accept the limits others try to impose on us. That is the legacy of Queen Amina of Zaria, and it will endure as long as her story continues to be told. If this story moved you, inspired you, or taught you something you didn't know before, I have a simple request. Share it. Tell someone about Queen Amina of Zaria. Post about her on social media. Recommend this video to friends who love history. Because stories like this, stories that have been marginalized and overlooked for too long, only survive when people actively work to keep them alive. Hit that like button if you believe history should include everyone's story, not just the ones we've traditionally been taught. Drop a comment telling me what aspect of Amina's story resonated with you most. Was it her military genius, her political acumen, her defiance of gender norms, or something else entirely? And absolutely subscribe to this channel because we're on a mission to uncover and share the incredible historical stories that deserve to be as famous as any European king or ancient emperor. There are so many more stories like Amina's waiting to be told. African leaders, Asian conquerors, indigenous American civilizations, women warriors from every continent. History is vast and magnificent when you stop treating it as the exclusive domain of Europe and men. We're building a community of people who believe that history should be immersive, accurate, and inclusive. Join us by subscribing. Turn on notifications so you never miss when we drop the next deep dive into a historical figure or event that should be world famous but isn't. Together, we can make sure that stories like Queen Amina's reach the audiences they deserve. We can decolonize history, one story at a time. Until next time, keep exploring, keep questioning what you've been taught, and keep believing that history is so much more than what made it into your school textbooks. This was the story of Queen Amina of Zaria, the warrior princess who built an empire and whose walls still stand 5 centuries later. Never forget her name,